February 19, 2013. Somewhere in downtown Los Angeles, a hotel employee reviews a security footage. What they are seeing looks like a scene straight out of a movie. A young woman enters an elevator. She presses several buttons. She waits. But the doors do not close. She remains motionless for a few seconds. Then she peeks out into the hallway. She looks to the left. She looks to the right. She hides back inside the elevator. She steps out again. She seems to notice something the camera cannot capture. Something that is out of frame. Something that we cannot see either. Over the next few seconds, her movements become increasingly strange. She approaches the doors. She steps back. She gestures with her hands. She moves her arms in a way that is difficult to interpret. And finally, she disappears down the hallway. It is the last time Elisa Lam is seen alive. When that recording was published days later, the internet exploded. Millions of people analyzed the video frame by frame. Some claimed she was running from someone. Others thought she was talking to an invisible person. There was no shortage of those who claimed the hotel was hiding something. And neither of those who were convinced that this was one of the most unsettling paranormal cases ever recorded by a security camera. But the more the video was observed, the more questions arose. Why did the elevator doors remain open? What was Elisa looking at off-camera? Why was she acting that way? And how was it possible that, after disappearing from that footage, no one ever saw her alive again? The answer to those questions would lead to an investigation that would travel around the world. A story that mixes disappearance, mystery, internet rumors, misinterpretations, and a real tragedy that over time would end up being distorted by countless theories. But before talking about the elevator, before the hotel, before the disappearance, we have to talk about the person appearing in that video. Because for years, millions of people knew the images. But very few truly knew Elisa Lam. And to understand how this story began, we have to travel thousands of miles north of Los Angeles, to Vancouver, Canada, where a 21-year-old young woman was about to undertake the journey that would change her life forever. Before becoming one of the most analyzed images on the internet, before her name appeared in documentaries, forums, and theories of all kinds, Elisa Lam was a 21-year-old young woman living in Vancouver, Canada. A student, a daughter, a girl with routines, plans, and a life that, from the outside, did not seem very different from that of anyone else her age. She was born into a family of Hong Kong origin and grew up in an environment marked by the cultural mix between her family heritage and life in Canada. Its parents worked in a restaurant and, as documented in later interviews, Elisa maintained a close relationship with her family. She studied at the university and led a relatively quiet life. She liked to write, especially on her personal blog, where she shared thoughts, reflections, and small fragments of her day-to-day life. In those texts, there was nothing to anticipate what would happen later. There were no signs of an extraordinary destiny. There was no indication that her name would end up being known worldwide. However, there was something that would later be mentioned in the investigation. Elisa had a history of mental health issues. This is an important but also delicate point. Because in this type of case, it is essential not to reduce a person to a diagnosis. The only thing relevant to the investigation is that there was medical treatment and prior follow-up, something that would later be taken into account in official reports. But beyond any label, what her acquaintances describe as a sensitive young woman, reserved at times, with creative interests and an active inner life, reflected in her writings. In 2013, Elisa decided to take a trip. A solo trip along the west coast of the United States. The kind of trip that many young people take to discover new cities, break the routine, and gain independence. Her final destination was Los Angeles. During that journey, she stayed in different places until she reached one of the best-known, and also most controversial, hotels in the city. Cecil Hotel. The hotel was located in an area that already at that time had a bad reputation, especially due to crime and the constant presence of complex social situations in the surroundings. But Elisa was not the only guest. Far from it. The building housed dozens of people with completely different stories. Tourists, long-term residents, temporary workers, and people in situations of vulnerability. The Cecil was not just a hotel. It was a place with many lives happening at the same time. Elisa arrived there like any other guest. She checked in. She settled into a shared room initially. And she began to explore the city. During the first few days, her behavior seemed normal. She visited tourist spots. She communicated with her family. She maintained regular contact. Nothing indicated that she was in immediate danger. However, as the days went by, Some signs began to appear that would later be analyzed in the investigation. Small changes in her routine, variations in her behavior, and a series of communications that, seen in retrospect, would generate many interpretations. But at that moment, none of that seemed enough to anticipate what was about to happen. Because while Elisa toured Los Angeles, something was brewing in parallel inside the hotel itself. A huge building, with long hallways, old elevators, and a history marked by dark episodes that, over time, would contribute to fueling the mystery around the case. However, what really matters in the story is not the building itself. It is what happened inside it during Elisa Lam's final days. Days that began to bring her closer, without anyone knowing it, to the moment when her image would be recorded forever in that elevator video. A video that, at that point in the story, no one had seen yet. But that was about to change everything. In missing person investigations, the last known days of a person are usually the most important part of the case. It is the moment when everything still seems normal, but where, in retrospect, every little detail takes on a different meaning. In the case of Elisa Lam, those final days took place inside the Cecil Hotel, a building where very different stories converged under the same roof. Tourists, workers, long-term residents, and people living in much more unstable conditions. Elisa shared the hotel with all of them, and at first, her stay did not seem out of the ordinary. During her first days in Los Angeles, she maintained contact with her family in Canada. She communicated regularly. She discussed her plans. She talked about her trip. There were no obvious signs of alarm. But with the passage of time, some changes began to be recorded. Not dramatic changes, but subtle variations. Small alterations in the routine that, on their own, did not seem significant. However, in a subsequent investigation, these details would be reviewed closely. One of the most important elements was her behavior inside the hotel. Elisa did not stay constantly in her room. She moved around the building. She used common spaces. She interacted in a limited way with other guests. None of this was strange in itself. But what caught attention later was the irregularity of some recorded movements. The hotel had security cameras in different areas, and those cameras began to capture Elisa at different times of the day. Going up, going down, crossing hallways, entering and leaving common areas. Most of these images showed nothing alarming, but they did allow for the reconstruction of a fragmented routine. A series of isolated moments that, joined together, composed an incomplete picture of her last days. The breaking point came when inconsistencies began to appear in the hotel records. Moments when Elisa was not located on the recordings during specific periods. Instances when her whereabouts inside the building were unclear. And finally, a moment when she simply stopped being seen. There was no goodbye. There was no final communication with her family. There was no message indicating a clear decision to leave the hotel. Simply, at a certain point in the timeline, her trail inside the building disappeared. In parallel, her family began to notice the lack of contact. At first, they thought it could be a temporary disconnection typical of a trip. But as the hours passed, concern grew. They tried to communicate with her, without success, and uncertainty began to grow. Meanwhile, at the hotel, Elisa's absence was not immediately detected by the staff. The Cecil was a large building, with multiple guests, and with a constant activity that made it difficult to immediately perceive the absence of a specific person. The days moved forward, and the situation went from being a simple lack of contact to a formal disappearance. It was then that the first search protocols were activated. The authorities began to gather information. Records were reviewed. Cameras were analyzed. And an attempt was made to reconstruct her last movements inside the building. But there was one element that stood out above everything else. A fragment of video that, although not widely known at that time, would end up becoming the central piece of the entire investigation. A video recorded inside an elevator. A video that, once seen, would forever change the way the case would be interpreted by the whole world. Because from that moment on, Elisa's disappearance would cease to be just an investigation, and it would become a global mystery. If there is an exact point at which Elisa Lam's case stopped being just another disappearance and became a global phenomenon, that moment is this. The elevator video. A security recording from the Cecil Hotel that, over time, would be played millions of times around the world. Analyzed, reinterpreted, dismantled frame by frame. But in its original form, the video comes with no explanation. It only shows a young woman inside an elevator. Elisa enters the frame. She stops. She looks out. She presses several buttons. The doors remain open. That detail, apparently minor, is the first element that draws attention. Under normal conditions, an elevator should close after a few seconds of inactivity. But in the recording, the doors do not respond as expected. Elisa moves within the small space. She peeks into the hallway. She looks both ways, as if she were checking something, or as if she were avoiding something. Then she returns to the inside of the elevator. She stands still for a few seconds, and then begins the sequence that has generated thousands of interpretations. Elisa steps out again. Her movements are quick, but she does not seem to be clearly fleeing, nor does she seem to be interacting with anyone visible in the frame. She raises her arms. She makes gestures. Her hands move irregularly, as if she were communicating, or reacting to something we cannot see. She goes back in. She steps out again. The pattern repeats. Elevator, hallway, elevator, hallway. At some moments she seems to look toward a specific point off camera. At others, her behavior seems to stop abruptly, as if she were listening to something, or as if she changed her mind. Finally, after several seconds of erratic movements, Elisa leaves the elevator for good. She heads down the hallway, and disappears from the camera's field of vision. From that instant on, she is never recorded in that video again. When the recording was released, the impact was immediate. The internet reacted with an unusual intensity even by the standards of viral cases. The video was shared on forums, social networks, and video platforms. And interpretations began to multiply. Some people claimed Elisa was being pursued. Others believed she was trying to hide from someone. Theories also emerged speaking of a possible psychological crisis or an episode of disorientation. And, as happens in many cases of this type, there was no shortage of paranormal explanations. However, the video itself does not offer clear answers. It only shows fragments of behavior, and each viewer interprets those fragments from their own perspective. For investigators, the recording was an important piece, but not a definitive one. It showed Elisa's behavior at a specific moment, but it did not explain what happened before, nor what happened after, nor the external circumstances that could have influenced her conduct. That is the central problem of this video. It is extremely powerful from a visual standpoint, but limited from an explanatory standpoint, because a camera can record movements, but it cannot record intentions, nor perceptions, nor the full context of what is happening outside its field of vision. Following the release of the video, attention on the case increased exponentially. Public interest grew. The media began to cover the story more intensely, and pressure on the investigation increased. The next step was clear: to determine what happened after Elisa left the elevator, and, above all, to locate her. But at that time, no one imagined that the answer would not be in the main building, nor in the hallways, nor in the rooms, but in a much more unexpected place. A place that would explain the mystery, but that would also add a tragic dimension to the whole story. For weeks, the case of Elisa Lam became a constant search, an attempt to reconstruct her last movements within the city, and, above all, inside the Cecil Hotel. The elevator video had already gone viral. The theories were multiplying, and media pressure grew every day. But the essential question remained unanswered. Where was Elisa? The investigation progressed slowly. Security cameras were reviewed. Guests and employees were interviewed. Different areas of the building were inspected, but there were no clear signs of her whereabouts. The hotel was large, complex, with multiple levels and low traffic areas, and that made the search difficult. In this context, something happened that would completely change the course of the case. Some guests began to report problems with the water, specifically with the taste and pressure of the supply. What initially seemed like a technical problem with the building led staff to check the hotel's water systems. The procedure was routine. No one expected to find anything out of the ordinary. However, during the inspection, one of the workers accessed the water cisterns located on the roof of the building, and that was when the discovery was made. Inside one of the water tanks lay the body of Elisa Lam. The impact of the news was immediate. The same hotel that had been the setting for the video that had traveled around the world now became the place where the definitive answer was found. The location of the body added a new dimension to the case, because it was not an area visible to guests, nor an area of regular access. It was a technical space related to the building's water supply. The news generated an immediate wave of questions. How had Elisa gotten there? When did it happen? And above all, how had it gone unnoticed for so long in a search that had already begun days earlier? The authorities began working on the reconstruction of the facts. Accesses were reviewed. Possible routes within the building were analyzed. And an attempt was made to determine if the young woman had reached the place by her own means or if there had been some type of external intervention. Over time, the forensic investigation would provide key elements to answer some of these questions. But at that moment, the only clear thing was the finding, and the fact that the mystery of the elevator now had a physical resolution. The place where the building's water was stored had contained, for days, an answer that no one had been able to see. And that discovery would change the direction of the entire investigation. Because from that instant on, the question was no longer only where Elisa was, but how she had gotten there, and what explanation could make sense of everything that had been seen in the video. The next step would be to determine the causes of death. And that is where one of the most important and most misinterpreted parts of the entire case would begin. With the discovery of the body in the cisterns of the Cecil Hotel, the case of Elisa Lam entered a new phase. The forensic phase. Until then, the investigation had been dominated by images, theories, and partial reconstructions. But from here on, the objective was different. To determine exactly what happened and why. The body was subjected to standard autopsy procedures. Internal analyses were performed. External examinations. And toxicology tests. Each element aimed to reconstruct Elisa's final hours of life with the greatest possible precision. The forensic report concluded that the cause of death was consistent with accidental drowning. That is, Elisa would have died after coming into contact with the water inside the tank where she was found. This point is important because it establishes a clear line within the official investigation. No conclusive evidence of external traumatic injuries indicating a direct physical attack was found. Nor were signs consistent with a violent assault prior to death identified. However, the toxicology analysis did reveal a relevant element. The presence of substances in her system related to medications used to treat mental health disorders. This finding was interpreted within the known medical context of the victim and formed part of the general evaluation of the case. Forensic authorities concluded that the body of evidence was consistent with an episode of altered behavior prior to death. Here is where the case begins to split into two distinct levels of interpretation. On one side, the official conclusion based on available evidence. On the other, the public interpretation of the case, which in many instances had been formed from the elevator video. Because while the report spoke of accidental drowning, a large part of the public continued trying to fit the behavior observed in the recording into much more complex theories. Some people felt the official explanation did not resolve all the questions. Others accepted the forensic conclusion as the closing of the case. And a third group continued to explore alternative interpretations that, in many cases, were not backed by solid evidence. But from a strictly forensic standpoint, the investigation found no conclusive indications suggesting the intervention of a third party as a direct cause of death. This point is crucial to understanding the case as a whole. Because the contrast between what the elevator video showed and what the autopsy established was what fueled much of the subsequent debate. On one side, a highly unsettling image. On the other, a medical conclusion pointing to a much more conventional explanation within accidental causes of death. The tension between the two is what kept global interest alive for years. However, the forensic report also had limitations. As occurs in any investigation of this type, the autopsy cannot reconstruct with total precision the mental state of the person in their final moments. Nor can it explain with absolute certainty all the behaviors observed previously. Its function is to determine physical causes of death and rule out or confirm probable scenarios based on biological and medical evidence. In the case of Elisa Lam, the main conclusion was clear from a medical standpoint. But it left open interpretative questions that, over time, would be exploited by internet theories and speculations. Because although the autopsy closed one part of the case, it could not close the public conversation that had already been generated around the elevator video. And in that space between scientific evidence and collective perception is where the case of Elisa Lam became something much bigger than a forensic investigation. It became a cultural phenomenon. And in the next chapter is where we will see how the theories that still circulate on the internet today were born. Few cases have generated as many interpretations as that of Elisa Lam. And probably none has done so from a single fragment of video. The material recorded in the elevator of the Cecil Hotel became the starting point for countless theories that circulated on the internet for years. Some attempted to explain Elisa's behavior from a medical or psychological perspective. Others looked for an external cause. and others went directly into the realm of the inexplicable. But before analyzing them, it is important to remember something essential. A theory is not a fact. A theory is an interpretation. And in a case like this, where there are limitations in the available information, the difference between the two is fundamental. Theory 1. The episodio of psychological alteration. This is one of the most widely accepted explanations within the medical and forensic fields. According to this interpretation, Elisa would have experienced an episode of disorientation or behavioral alteration in her final moments. This could explain her erratic movements in the elevator, the repetition of actions, the gestures with her hands, and the apparent lack of coherence in her behavior. This hypothesis is supported by the fact that there was a known history of treatment related to mental health. It is also consistent with the forensic conclusion of accidental drowning. However, even this theory cannot reconstruct with precision what Elisa was perceiving at that moment. It can only infer behaviors from what was observed. Theory 2. Third-party intervention. This is one of the most widespread theories on the internet. According to this hypothesis, Elisa would have been pursued or influenced by another person inside the hotel. Some defenders of this idea point to her behavior in the elevator as a possible reaction to an external presence. Others point to alleged inconsistencies in the hotel records. However, it is important to note that there is no conclusive evidence backing the presence of an aggressor in the moments captured by the camera. The investigations did not identify solid proof of direct third-party intervention as a cause of death. Even so, this theory continues to circulate due to the visual impact of the video and the difficulty of objectively interpreting what is observed in it. Theory 3. The paranormal explanation. Probably one of the most popular on the internet, though also the least supported by evidence. This theory suggests that Elisa would have been reacting to an invisible presence or an inexplicable phenomenon. The behavior in the elevator has been used as a basis for these interpretations. However, from the standpoint of the official investigation, there is no element suggesting a supernatural cause. The case has been explained within medical, forensic, and circumstantial parameters. Despite this, the theory stayed alive for years due to the eerie nature of the video and its dissemination on digital platforms. Theory 4. Flaws in the investigation. This interpretation does not focus on how Elisa died, but on how the investigation was conducted. Some people questioned the search times inside the hotel, or the initial difficulty in locating the body in the cisterns. There was also debate regarding the public communication of the case and the clarity of the reports. However, these questionings have not led to evidence contradicting the main forensic conclusions. They are criticisms of the process rather than alternative evidence of what occurred. What is sustained? Despite the diversity of theories, the official investigation establishes some key points. Elisa was found in a hotel cistern. The cause of death was deemed consistent with accidental drowning. No conclusive evidence of external assault was found. The behavior observed in the video does not on its own allow for the determination of a criminal cause. These elements form the basis of the official conclusion of the case, and any alternative interpretation must necessarily confront these facts. After analyzing the video, the hotel, the discovery, and the various theories, the investigation into Elisa Lam's case reached a conclusion based on the available evidence. It is not a perfect answer. It does not eliminate all questions, but it does establish an official reconstruction of the facts. Elisa Lam arrived in Los Angeles in 2013 as part of a solo trip along the west coast of the United States. During her stay, she lodged at the Cecil Hotel, where she spent her final days alive. At some point during her stay, Elisa began to display behavior that would later be described as unusual within the hotel environment. Security cameras recorded part of her movements within the building. She went up and down different floors. She moved through hallways and common areas. And she was seen for the last time in the famous elevator video. After that recording, her trail inside the hotel is lost. There are no clear images documenting exactly what happened in the subsequent interval. Following her disappearance from the visual record, Elisa accessed at some point an area of the building that was not for regular guest use. Specifically, the area where the hotel's water cisterns were located. This access was possible due to the structure of the building, which featured multiple technical zones and entry points not directly monitored by cameras in all cases. Once in that area, Elisa ended up inside one of the water tanks. The forensic investigation determined that the cause of death was consistent with accidental drowning. No conclusive evidence of direct third-party intervention as a cause of death was found. The toxicology analysis indicated the presence of substances related to previously prescribed medication, which was considered within the victim's medical context. With these elements, the official hypothesis concluded that the death was accidental. Although the investigation establishes a general explanation, there are aspects that cannot be determined with absolute precision. Elisa's exact mental state in her final moments. The exact sequence of decisions that led her to the cistern area. The subjective interpretation of her behavior in the elevator video. These points are part of the standard limitations in investigations of this nature. One of the most important elements of the case is the difference between what the evidence shows and what the public perceives. The elevator video generated a massive amount of interpretations. But forensic investigation is not based on isolated visual interpretation. It is based on physical, medical, and contextual evidence. And it is precisely that difference that explains why the case remains debated years later. From the authorities' point of view, the case was closed as an accidental death, without sufficient evidence to sustain third-party involvement, without conclusive proof of a criminal act, and with a reconstruction that, within its limitations, fit the forensic findings. But even with an official conclusion, Elisa Lam's case did not disappear from public conversation. Because there are stories that do not end when reports are closed. Stories that remain, not because of what is left to explain, but because of what they made those who watched them feel. And in this case, it all began with an image. A young woman inside an elevator. And a question that still echoes across the internet today. What was it that we really saw? The elevator is empty. The doors open and close in silence. There is no longer anyone inside. Only a recording remains. A fragment of time frozen on a screen. Over the years, the video of Elisa Lam ceased to be just a piece of an investigation. It became a symbol of mystery, of interpretation, and also of how the internet transforms the unknown into global narratives. But behind all of that, there was a real person. A young woman who traveled alone, who walked through an unfamiliar city, and whose name ended up associated with one of the most unsettling images ever captured by a security camera. The case was closed. The theories continued. But the story, at its core, was always the same. Someone who disappeared, and a whole world trying to understand why.